physical structures, it could in behavioral repertoires as well. But okay, so
your follow-up, Ohio?
Next question.
Yes, well, he didn't quite get to the AI, but my second question had to do with...
I can answer that. Yeah, I think there's nothing that, in principle, that would prevent a human-made system from being intelligent, and in fact, in many ways, our computers already are intelligent.
Well, my second question did have to do with Francis Crick, who I believe in the years before he passed was trying to use vision as, if you will, a rabbit hole to the study of consciousness, and if you had any thoughts on his late work.
Yeah, I think that was an ingenious research strategy. I mean, how do you study consciousness? In particular, his goal was the neural correlates of consciousness. What happens in the brain that corresponds to being aware of something? And he suggested, quite reasonably, that vision would be a good way of getting at it, because when we see something, that's a very concrete instance of being conscious of it. I see it, it's red, it's square, it's 4 feet away. And then there are tricks that a neuroscientist can use to find out what process in the brain corresponds to that. And an example being the phenomenon of what's called binocular rivalry. If you have one thing shown to one eye and another thing shown to the other eye, an example is if you take a tube of paper, roll up paper into a tube, and then look at your hand through the tube through one eye while keeping the other eye open. Then what will happen is you'll see your hand through the tube, and then it will disappear and it'll look as if there's a hole in your hand. Then the hole will fill in, then it will disappear and fill in again, and so on. That's because your brain is having trouble merging the two very different images coming from the two eyes into a single percept. Well, this has been known in psychology for 100 years, but Crick and many others noted, well, that's a great way to study consciousness, because the information coming in from the two eyeballs is the same. The experience of the whole person fluctuates. A few seconds hand, few seconds whole, few seconds hand, few seconds whole. If you can find what part in the brain changes when a guy says, oh, now it's a hole, and then changes back when he says, now it's a hand, you're getting at the part of the brain that must register the contents of consciousness as opposed to just the raw data coming in from the eyeballs. Even better, you can do it with monkeys, because monkeys can be trained to flip a lever every time what they're seeing changes, and you can actually implant electrodes in the monkey's brain, something you can't do with humans, to find out what's changing in the monkey's brain when the monkey's experience changes. So I think it's a terrific research program, and it's shed a lot of light on what goes on in the brain that makes us conscious.
Where, in your opinion, is the best research done in your field?
Oh, it's nowadays one of the glories of the American research system is that it's distributed over many, many universities.
So it's not just the government anymore? Or was it ever just the government?
It probably never was the government, but it used to be often private labs that were, it used to be, in the 19th century, it would be kind of English country gentlemen like Darwin puttering around in his greenhouse. Now, since the Second World War, the federal government has paid for basic research, and it's at hundreds of universities all over the world.
Now, this is the kind of research that sometimes gets the front page headlines as being not a good thing. We're spending X million of dollars looking at such and such behavior in chimpanzees. When you see something when you see something like that, you go, wait a minute. This is important research.
And I assume it's okay am I allowed to bring up Sarah Palin?
Oh, you can bring up anything you want, sure.
The most hair-raising, egregious, nauseating example of this occurred just last week when Sarah Palin ridiculed the idea that the federal government would sponsor research on fruit flies. And then she followed by saying, I kid you not, as if this was the most absurd thing, ignoring the fact that almost everything we know about genetics originally came from research on fruit flies, such as the existence and behavior of chromosomes, which is one of the things that allows us to determine the cause of Down syndrome, something that she claims to be interested in devoting more resources toward. So genetics is something you study with fruit flies. Fruit flies are also a major economic pest. Huge citrus industry in California and Florida can be threatened by quirks of the behavior of the fruit fly. So in picking what she thought sounded like an example of government waste, she was identifying possibly the most one of the most important bodies of research in the entire scientific enterprise. And John McCain did the same thing. In 2 debates, he ridiculed research on the DNA of bears, of grizzly bears, not realizing that nowadays, if you're a biologist, you study DNA. Even if you're a field biologist looking at conservation of endangered species, and grizzly bears are a threatened species, there's a federal mandate to keep track of their numbers. How do you know whether you've seen 2 grizzly bears or whether you've seen 1 grizzly bear twice? Well, you snag bits of their hair and you do DNA analysis, and that's how we know how many grizzly bears are out there. In making the cheap shot of, well, I don't know if it's for a paternity test or a crime scene, both he and Palin, I think, showed a certain contempt for science that I and many other scientists find deeply disturbing. If you describe any scientific research out of context, you can make it sound silly. I think it's utterly irresponsible for a politician to do that, given how much of the fate of our country and our species is going to depend on basic and applied scientific research.
Has Barack Obama done that?
No, he has not had any cheap shots about scientific funding. No.
Prescott, Arizona. Hello.
Hi there. I had a twofold question. Where do ADD, ADHD, autism and other disabilities fit in, and how can our educational system be improved to make these people more productive and less marginalized?
Again, I'm going to have to speak rather vaguely, kind of like politicians, because I'm not a clinician or an expert in disorders. Well, certainly we should understand them, all of these syndromes, and that does involve research. We should make finer distinctions. A lot of these are very broad kind of garbage categories where any child who is learning in a slightly different way gets thrown into them, often because of the incentive structure of special education, that they get extra attention and extra resources if they're diagnosed as falling into a certain category. So we need better and more honest categories, and also an incentive structure in the schools that it isn't the case that you have to be diagnosed with a condition, given a label, in order to get this extra attention. I think perhaps genetics might help us in subdividing what seems to be a big ragbag of very different syndromes that all get called autism spectrum disorder or ADHD, that there are probably lots of subtypes that we might be able to differentiate with better genetics research. And better understanding, I think, just of the basic processes of how all of us learn to read, learn to add, remember information, make sense of scientific principles, so that we can pinpoint what is being done differently or what's going awry in the abnormal cases. I think all too often we give these off-the-shelf tests that just show that something is going wrong without really understanding what it is that's going wrong, partly because we don't understand what goes right when it does go right. So I like to start from a better understanding of how reading and math and scientific understanding work in the normal case.
Out to the West Coast now, Oregon. Is it Puyallup? Is that how you pronounce that?
I'm from Puyallup, Washington.
Puyallup, go ahead.
First off, I'm very glad about his last answer regarding autism spectrum disorder. That made me very happy. I have a 14-year-old girl who is diagnosed with PDD-NOS in the autism spectrum disorder. And I have an 8-year-old son who was diagnosed as developmentally delayed when he was 3. And they have very different brains, and they react to everything completely differently. And I'm fascinated by the genetics because they both came from me, but 6 years apart. And one is a boy and one is a girl. Now, the boy has a phenomenal memory. He can look at things and memorize them, and 3 years later still remember them. My daughter, however, cannot make connections and leaps. She cannot remember mathematic facts. She cannot remember what she did last week. She doesn't, make the connections in her brain, and therefore her memory isn't great. But she's in the moment all the time. She lives in a Zen kind of environment, and it frustrates my son greatly. Do you have any ideas about, why these two are so diametrically opposed from each other, and how they both came from me, and what we can do to help them communicate better, and genetically how they got this way? What are your thoughts on this subject?
Well, even full biological siblings only share half of their genes.